In the autumn of 1887, a surveyor for the United States Geological Survey named Elias Ward was mapping the uncharted contours of the Cumberland Plateau in eastern Kentucky. He was a meticulous man, known for his precise hand and his habit of keeping a daily journal. On October 14, he recorded an unusual discovery in his log, a notation that he had found a curious formation near the headwaters of Rock Creek, consistent with ancient workings, possible evidence of prior occupation. He sketched a rough map of the area, noting the presence of a collapsed timber structure partially obscured by thick mountain laurel and rhododendron. 3 days later, Elias Ward vanished. His mule was found wandering the following morning, its pack still loaded with surveying equipment. His tent was discovered a mile away, undisturbed. His journal was open on the ground, the final entry simply stating, "Returning to the hollow to investigate further." Strange marks in the stone. Not natural. A search party was organized, composed of local men from the nearby settlement of Paint Lick and a deputy U.S. Marshal passing through the area. They combed the dense forest for 2 weeks. They found nothing, no trace of Elias Ward, no sign of a struggle, no explanation for the hollow he had mentioned. The prevailing theory was that he had fallen into an abandoned mine shaft, a common hazard in the region, but no such shaft could be located. Others whispered that he had encountered a bear, or had simply lost his mind in the isolation of the wilderness and wandered off to die. But one member of the search party, a grizzled Civil War veteran named Jeremiah Creech, noticed something the others ignored. Near the site where the mule had been found, he discovered a single object half buried in the mud, a hand-carved wooden brooch, intricately decorated with a pattern of interlocking circles, and bearing the initials MH etched into its back. Jeremiah had lived in these mountains for over 50 years, had fought in the war, had seen the rise and fall of the region's fortunes. He had seen a lot of strange things in his time. But this felt different. Jeremiah Creech kept the brooch. He took it back to his cabin on the edge of the Laurel Creek settlement, and he placed it in a small wooden box he kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard. He didn't show it to anyone, not even his wife. He had a feeling, a deep, unsettling, gut-level feeling, that he had stumbled onto something that was best left alone. For Jeremiah Creech, the disappearance of Elias Ward was not just a tragedy. It was a warning. The Hollow Mountain had claimed another soul, and it would not be the last. The search for Elias Ward was eventually abandoned, and his name faded into the collective memory of the region as just another casualty of the unforgiving wilderness. The story of the missing surveyor became a local legend, a story told around fires to scare children, a ghost story to be whispered on cold nights. But for Jeremiah Creech, it was a secret he would carry to his grave. To understand what happened to Elias Ward, and to the many others who would follow him into the hollow, we must first understand the mountain itself. The Cumberland Plateau is not a single, monolithic mountain, it is a vast, uplifted sandstone tableland that stretches across eastern Kentucky, Tennessee, and into West Virginia. It is a region of deep, narrow gorges, sheer cliffs, and dense, almost impenetrable forests. For centuries, it served as a natural barrier, a place of refuge, and a source of mystery. The soil is thin and poor for farming, but the earth holds riches far more valuable to the outside world: iron ore, coal, salt, and timber. The region's history is written not in the grand battles of the Civil War, but in the desperate struggles of families to scratch out a living on the unforgiving land and the relentless exploitation of its resources by outside industrial interests. The mountains were, in the words of one 19th-century geologist, a fortress of solitude, a labyrinth of secrets. This landscape, steep, dissected, and cloaked in a perpetual haze of blue-gray mist, breathes a particular kind of silence, a silence that can amplify a whisper into a threat and swallow a cry for help without a trace. The dense, tangled undergrowth and the towering hardwoods create a world of perpetual shade and shadow, where the light filters down in scattered beams, illuminating the forest floor in a patchwork of sun and gloom. It is a place where a man could vanish, and often did, without a sound. The area around the headwaters of Rock Creek, where Elias Ward had been surveying, was particularly rugged. It was a bowl-shaped depression in the plateau, a natural amphitheater of stone and forest, known to the locals simply as the Hollow. There was a strange feeling to the place, an unnerving quiet that seemed to absorb all sound. The local Native American tribes, the Shawnee and the Cherokee, had long avoided the area, believing it to be a place of bad medicine. They spoke of spirits that dwelled in the dark crevices of the rock, and of whispers that could lure a man astray. When the first European settlers pushed into the region in the late 18th century, they, too, felt the unease, but they were a pragmatic people, driven by the promise of cheap land and the allure of self-reliance. They built their cabins on the edge of the hollow, they farmed the narrow valley floors, and they hunted the abundant deer and bear. But they remained wary. In the decades after the Civil War, the character of the region began to change. The wounds of the war were deep and slow to heal. Kentucky, a border state, had been torn apart by the conflict, with families and communities often finding themselves on opposite sides. Men who had fought for the Union and men who had fought for the Confederacy returned home to a land that had been bled dry and was still simmering with resentment. The region experienced a period of profound social and economic upheaval, and this was reflected in the mountain towns. In 1872, the first railroad line pushed into the area, connecting the rich coal fields of the Cumberland Plateau to the markets of the East. The railroad brought with it a new kind of settler, not the self-sufficient farmer or the independent hunter, but the industrialist, the speculator, the company man. Towns that had been sleepy crossroads of a few hundred souls were transformed almost overnight into bustling, rough-and-tumble boomtowns, swollen with miners, loggers, and the inevitable tide of gamblers, saloon-keepers, and outlaws that followed the promise of easy money. The old, settled ways of life, the bonds of family and community that had been the region's bedrock, began to fray. The mountains were no longer just a place to live, they were a resource to be extracted. A hierarchy quickly formed. At the top were the wealthy owners and investors, often from outside the region, who lived in safe, distant cities. At the bottom were the desperate men, often former Confederates and their families, who were forced to work in the mines and lumber camps for starvation wages. The space between them was filled by an army of middlemen, the foremen, the mine superintendents, the company attorneys, and the federal marshals, whose job was to keep the system running smoothly and to protect the interests of capital. In the mountains of the 1870s and 80s, the law was not a neutral arbiter of justice, but an arm of the powerful. The courts were the company stores, the sheriff's office, and often, the barrel of a six-shooter. It was into this volatile world that a young woman named Mary Halloran arrived in the early spring of 1880. She was a schoolteacher from Richmond, a city of some refinement, who had been hired by a newly established mining company to teach the children of its employees. By all accounts, Mary was a striking figure, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to see right through a man. She was educated, articulate, and fiercely independent, a rare combination for a woman of her time. She was also, as the foreman of the mine, a man named Silas Rourke, soon discovered, a woman of considerable courage. Mary's arrival caused a stir in the small, isolated community of Laurel Creek. She was a reminder of a world beyond the hollows and ridges, a world of books and ideas and political reform. She had not come to the mountains to seek her fortune or to flee a scandal. She had come, she told anyone who would listen, to bring the light of education to the dark corners of the state. She lived in a small cabin provided by the company, a modest structure that doubled as the schoolhouse. She taught reading, writing, and arithmetic to a motley crew of children, the sons and daughters of miners, loggers, and a few local farmers who dared to send their children to the Yankee Woman's School. She was, in her own quiet way, a revolutionary. Silas Rourke was, by all accounts, a ruthless and brutal man. A former Confederate captain who had seen the worst of the war, he had learned to be hard and unforgiving. He had risen through the ranks of the mining company through a combination of cunning, violence, and an utter lack of scruples. His word was law in the mining camp, and he enforced it with a heavy hand. He was also a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted, and what he wanted, from the moment he saw her, was Mary Halloran. He began to pursue her, at first with a veneer of charm, then with aggressive insistence. He would visit her cabin, ostensibly to discuss the needs of the school, but always with a look in his eye that made Mary uncomfortable. He sent her gifts, to which she promptly returned. He threatened to have her fired if she did not comply with his advances. Mary, however, was not a woman to be easily frightened. She was a woman of principle, and she saw in Silas Rourke everything that was wrong with the world she had come to change.
The conflict between them came to a head on a warm evening in July 1880.
According to the testimony of a local farmer, who had been passing by on the road, a loud argument was heard coming from the schoolhouse. Mary's voice was clear and defiant, Rourke's was a low, angry growl. The farmer claimed he heard Rourke threaten to burn that schoolhouse to the ground and send you packing, one way or another. A few days later, Mary Halloran disappeared. Her absence was noted by a neighbor who had come to borrow a book. He reported it to the mines superintendent, who, in turn, notified the company's head of security.
The official response was swift and cynical.
She was a flighty woman, the superintendent later wrote in his report to the company's headquarters in New York. Must have decided mountain life was not for her. He theorized that she had simply packed her bags and walked out to the nearest stagecoach stop, heading back to the city. The case was closed.
No investigation was conducted.
No local lawman, in the pocket of the company, was willing to challenge the superintendent's ruling.
The company's investigation was, of course, a sham.
It was designed to protect the reputation of Silas Rourke and, by extension, the company itself. The last thing the mining concern wanted was a scandal that might attract the attention of state officials, the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, or worse, the press. They wanted the problem to go away quietly, and with a wave of a pen, it did. Mary Halloran's disappearance became another piece of local folklore, a story of a beautiful, headstrong woman who had perhaps run off with a traveling salesman or found her way back to the bosom of her city family. But her name lived on, a ghostly whisper in the mountains, a symbol of the brutality and indifference of the company's rule. At the time of her disappearance, the local constable was a man named Orville Hayes. A weak and timid man, he was in the pocket of the company, and he was more interested in keeping his job than in pursuing justice. He had, however, a younger brother named Caleb, who was a man of a different caliber. Caleb Hayes had fought in the Union Army, and he had seen the corruption and cruelty of men with power firsthand. He had returned from the war a cynical and angry man, and he harbored a deep-seated hatred for Silas Rourke, whom he considered a symbol of everything that was wrong with the South's new order.
For years after Mary's disappearance, rumors and whispers circulated.
One story, passed down through the generations of a local family, claimed that Mary's body was buried in a shallow grave in the woods, but that the location had been forgotten. Another tale, more elaborate, suggested that Silas Rourke had killed Mary in a fit of rage and had disposed of her body in a hollow deep within the mountain. But the most persistent rumor was that Mary's ghost still haunted the schoolhouse, her spirit unable to rest until her story was told. Jeremiah Creech, who had lived in the area his entire life and was now an old man, was in the unique position of having the local memory of the area, and he knew more about the place where Elias Ward had vanished than anyone else. He had heard of the hollow, the cave, the secret place where, as a young man, he had stumbled upon evidence of an ancient and mysterious past. After Mary's disappearance, the rumors seemed to solidify around that same location. It was as if the mountain itself had a hunger, a need to swallow secrets and keep them hidden forever. On a crisp, cold morning in November 1886, a stranger arrived in the Laurel Creek settlement. He was a man in his late 40s, with a weather-beaten face, sharp, intelligent eyes, and the unmistakable bearing of a military man. His name was Duncan McIntyre, and he was a former captain in the Confederate Army, a man who had ridden with the partisan Rangers of John Hunt Morgan. McIntyre was a complex figure, a man who had fought for the Confederacy but who had also been a vocal critic of the war's excesses. He was a lawyer by training, a man who believed in the law, but he was also a man of the frontier, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had survived by his wits and his skill with a gun. McIntyre had been sent to Laurel Creek by a friend in Washington, a senator who had heard troubling reports of the treatment of workers and the disappearance of the schoolteacher. The senator, a reformer from the North, suspected that the company was not merely profiting from the land, but was engaged in a systematic campaign of intimidation, bribery, and violence. He needed someone he could trust, someone with local knowledge, with a reputation for honesty and courage, to investigate the matter quietly. Duncan McIntyre was the perfect choice. He knew the region like the back of his hand, he was not afraid of the company's thugs, and he had a personal score to settle with Silas Rourke, who had, during the war, been responsible for the death of McIntyre's younger brother. McIntyre set himself up in a room at the town's only boarding house, run by the widow of a former miner. He posed as a mineral prospector, looking to purchase land for a speculative venture. He spent his days exploring the surrounding hills, making careful notes, and drawing maps, all the while cultivating contacts among the miners and the local farmers. He was particularly interested in the fate of Mary Halloran, and he was not shy about asking questions. He was also interested in the disappearance of Elias Ward, the surveyor, and the strange folklore surrounding the area. He knew that, in the mountains, the answers were often hidden in plain sight, buried beneath layers of silence and fear. One evening, he visited the cabin of Jeremiah Creech. The old man was skeptical at first, unwilling to share the secrets he had carried for so long. But McIntyre was a patient and persuasive man. He told Creech that he was not interested in the gold or the coal, but in finding the truth about the people who had been hurt by the mountain. He spoke of justice and honor, of the need to hold those who had committed crimes accountable. He also spoke of the power of a story to set things right. It was this last point that finally broke through Creech's defenses. The old man, who had spent his life as a silent witness to the region's brutality, recognized in McIntyre a kindred spirit, a man who understood the need to make things right. Jeremiah Creech showed him the brooch, the small, hand-carved wooden object he had found near the site of Elias Ward's disappearance. He told McIntyre the story of the hollow, the strange markings on the rock, and the feeling of dread that had always clung to the place. He also showed him the old map, the one that had been drawn by the surveyor, where Ward had marked the location of the ancient workings. "It's a place that don't want to be found," Jeremiah said, his voice low and strained. "It's got a memory, a bad one. And it takes things, Captain. It takes things and never gives them back." McIntyre listened carefully. He was not a man who believed in ghosts or superstition. He was a rationalist, a lawyer, a man of facts. But the story was compelling, and it fit with the pattern of disappearances that had plagued the region for years. He took the brooch and the map and thanked Jeremiah Creech for his trust. He promised to return, but first he needed to see the hollow for himself. The next morning, Duncan McIntyre set out for the headwaters of Rock Creek. He was a man who understood how to navigate the woods. He took careful note of the landmarks, the unusual rock formations, the way the streams flowed. He was guided by the map, but he was also guided by something else, the sense, deeply ingrained in him from his days as a scout, that the hollow was not just a place on a map. It was a presence, a living entity. The approach to the hollow was a descent into a world of profound silence. As he walked, the sounds of the forest, the calls of birds, the chatter of squirrels, the rustle of leaves, began to fade. A strange stillness settled over the landscape. The air grew cool and damp. The trees became older, their branches gnarled and twisted, heavy with moss. The path, barely visible, wound through a narrow crevice in the sandstone. He emerged into a small, enclosed valley, a perfect bowl of stone and forest. The sun barely penetrated the canopy, casting the entire scene in a dim, greenish light. In the center of the bowl, partially hidden by a thicket of rhododendron, he saw the remains of a structure, a large, circular depression, its edges lined with stones that had been carefully cut and fitted together. It was, as Elias Ward had suspected, an ancient mining pit. But it was unlike any mine he had ever seen. It was not a shaft sunk into the earth, but a circular pit, open to the sky, its walls lined with a smooth, black, glass-like stone that seemed to absorb the light. Standing at the edge of the pit, McIntyre felt a strange, unsettling sensation. It was not the fear of a physical threat, but a deeper, more primal unease, a feeling that he was being watched by something that was not quite alive. He peered into the depths, but they were lost in impenetrable shadow. The pit, he estimated, was at least 30 feet deep. In the center, he could just make out the outline of a dark opening, a passageway that seemed to lead deeper into the earth. The air emanating from the pit was cold and carried a faint, metallic scent. McIntyre spent the rest of the day exploring the area around the hollow. He found evidence of more recent activity, the remains of a campfire, the discarded shards of a whiskey bottle, and, most significantly, a small scrap of cloth caught on a thorny bush. It was a piece of cheap, rough-spun fabric of a type commonly worn by miners. He also found a single, peculiar object, a small piece of a blue-tinted glass, not a bottle fragment, but a lens, perhaps from a pair of spectacles. It could have been a coincidence, but it was a detail that stuck in his mind. He returned to the boarding house that night, exhausted and disturbed. He couldn't shake the feeling that the hollow was the key to the disappearances, the place where the mountain's secrets were held. He was now more determined than ever to uncover the truth. He was also worried. The hollow had a way of claiming people, and he had a feeling that his investigation was drawing him closer to something that was best left alone. Duncan McIntyre's investigation in Laurel Creek did not go unnoticed. His questions about the schoolteacher, his interest in the missing surveyor, and his frequent forays into the woods had attracted the attention of Silas Rourke. Rourke was a man who trusted no one and who believed that the only way to maintain control was through fear. He saw McIntyre as a threat, a meddler who had to be dealt with. He had been watching, waiting for an opportunity to act. One night, as McIntyre was returning to his room from a late meeting with a local farmer who had agreed to share his knowledge of the mining operations, he was ambushed in the narrow, dark street outside the boarding house. 3 men, armed with clubs, set upon him without warning. But McIntyre was a seasoned fighter, a man who had survived countless skirmishes during the war. He drew his revolver, the blast shattering the silence of the night. The first attacker went down with a bullet to his shoulder. The second lunged at him, and McIntyre met him with a powerful blow that sent him sprawling. The third, seeing his companions fall, fled into the darkness. The fight was over in seconds, but it had sent a clear message: Rourke was willing to use violence to stop his inquiry. McIntyre's gunshot had drawn a crowd. A few men had come out of their houses, their faces lit by the flickering light of their lanterns. He recognized the constable, Orville Hayes, standing on the porch of the boarding house, his face pale and drawn. The man's brother, Caleb, stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "You'd better get inside, Captain," Caleb said, his voice low and measured. "This is not a fight you can win." McIntyre holstered his weapon. "I've got nowhere else to go," he said. "I'm staying here until I get my answers." The ambush had 2 important effects. First, it convinced McIntyre that he was on the right track. Rourke's reaction was too violent to be an act of mere intimidation. He was afraid of what McIntyre might uncover. Second, it began to shift the balance of power in Laurel Creek. The men who had been silent for so long, who had been cowed by Rourke's brutality, saw that one man was willing to stand up to him. They saw a crack in the company's armor, and they began to talk. The floodgates were opening, and the truth was starting to trickle out. The most significant breakthrough came from an unexpected source: the cabin of a former miner named Jasper Tate. Jasper had been a deep miner for the company for 20 years, but he had been fired a few years back after he was caught stealing a small amount of coal to keep his family warm during a brutal winter. He was a broken man, consumed by bitterness and a deep-seated hatred for the company and its men. He lived alone, in a shack on the outskirts of town, a hermit who had little use for other people. But he had heard the shots, and he knew they were a sign of war. He also knew that McIntyre was a man who would fight for what he believed in. Jasper Tate sent word to McIntyre that he had something to show him. He was, he said, a man who knew the mountains better than anyone, and he had seen things that even the company didn't know about. The 2 men met in the woods, away from prying eyes. Jasper Tate led McIntyre to a remote ridge, where he pointed to a distant mountain. "You see that peak over there," he said. "The one that looks like a sleeping bear?" McIntyre nodded. "I know it. It's on the company's land." "That's where they buried her," Jasper said, his voice low and trembling. "That's where they put Miss Halloran." McIntyre felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He had known that Mary Halloran was dead, but to have confirmation was still a shock. "How do you know?" he asked. "I was part of the party that did it," Jasper said, his eyes fixed on the distant mountain. I was a young man then, desperate for money. Rourke told us it was the only way to keep the peace, that the woman was a troublemaker, that she was trying to ruin the company. He said she had to be taken care of. He paid us $100 each. I needed the money for my family. But I've never forgiven myself. I never will. McIntyre pressed him for details. Jasper Tate's story was a chilling one. Rourke had taken a group of 3 men, including Jasper, to the schoolhouse late one night. They had forced Mary to come with them. They had taken her deep into the mountain, to the hollow, the place the locals called the Devil's Seat. There, Silas Rourke had done the deed himself. He had struck her, once, with a heavy rock. He had then ordered the men to bury her in the ancient pit, the one that Elias Ward had discovered. They had left her there, in the dark, alone. But that was only the beginning of the story. There was something else, Jasper said, his voice barely a whisper. Something I've never told anyone. He paused, as if fighting a great internal battle. When we were burying her, we found something else. A tunnel, a passageway leading off from the pit. It was blocked by a cave-in, but we could hear things. Hear things? McIntyre asked. What things? Voices, Jasper Tate said. Whispering voices. And the sound of water running deep beneath the mountain. It was like the mountain was alive, talking to us. Rourke made us swear an oath of silence, a blood oath. He said if we ever told a soul, he would kill us, and our families. I was never so scared in my life. McIntyre now had the testimony he needed. He had a witness, a flawed witness, but a witness nonetheless, who could place Silas Rourke at the scene of Mary Halloran's murder. But the story of the voices, the tunnel, and the strange, ancient pit was troubling. It was the kind of story that would be dismissed as the ramblings of a bitter old man. He needed more than just Jasper Tate's testimony, he needed physical evidence. He needed to go back to the hollow, to the Devil's Seat, to see for himself what was there. His investigation also took a more conventional turn. He began to pore over the company's records, which he had obtained, with some difficulty, from a disgruntled clerk. He found a pattern of suspicious activity that extended far beyond the murder of a single schoolteacher. He discovered that the company's surveyors had been deliberately misrepresenting the boundaries of the land, in order to claim territory that belonged to other people, including a local family, the Whitfields, who had been driven off their land through a combination of legal chicanery and threats of violence. The records also revealed a systematic pattern of wage theft and intimidation. The company was not merely exploiting the land, it was building a mountain empire through fraud and terror. McIntyre's investigation was now a race against time. He had to gather enough evidence, enough proof, to convince the federal authorities to act. He knew that Silas Rourke would stop at nothing to silence him. He was also haunted by the strange voices that Jasper Tate had described. He had to know what lay beneath the mountain, what secret the company was so desperate to protect. He decided to make one final trip to the hollow, to see if there was any truth to the story. He returned to the Devil's Seat on a moonless night. He was not a superstitious man, but the place had a profound effect on him. The silence was even more oppressive than before. As he stood on the edge of the pit, the same cold, metallic smell filled the air. He lowered himself down into the pit using a rope. The descent was slow and difficult, his boots finding precarious footholds in the slick, black glass. When he reached the bottom, he was standing on a floor of loose rock and debris. In the center, partially hidden by a large boulder, he saw the opening of a tunnel, a dark, jagged wound in the mountainside. He took a lantern from his pack and lit it. The light flickered and danced, revealing the passageway to be low and narrow, barely wide enough for a man to crawl through. The walls were rough, natural rock, but there were markings on them, strange, swirling patterns that he did not recognize. They were not natural, they were human-made, but they were unlike anything he had ever seen. He began to crawl, the passageway sloping downward. The air grew even colder, and the metallic scent intensified. After crawling for what felt like an eternity, the passageway opened into a larger cavern. It was a vast, subterranean space, the ceiling lost in darkness. And in the center of the cavern, he saw it, an immense, underground lake, its surface as black and still as obsidian. The walls of the cavern were covered in more of the strange markings. But it was the objects on the shore of the lake that held his attention, a collection of human bones, carefully arranged in a pattern, as if in some kind of ritual. And among the bones, a single, unmistakable object, a small, wooden brooch, identical to the one Jeremiah Creech had found, bearing the initials MH. McIntyre returned from the hollow a changed man. He was pale, shaken, and he had seen something in the darkness that had left him deeply disturbed. He now knew that Mary Halloran's body was not buried in the hollow's pit, it was in the cavern, beside the dark lake, a sacrifice to something ancient and terrible that lived beneath the mountain. He knew that the company's secrets were not just about money and power, they were about a ritual, a covenant with a malevolent force. And Silas Rourke was the high priest of this profane cult. He went to see Jeremiah Creech. "I've seen the hollow," he said. "There's a lake down there, a lake of dark water. And there are bones. And this was there." He showed Creech the brooch. "It matches the one you gave me. Both bear the initials MH. The teacher's remains are there." Jeremiah Creech's face went pale. He had known the mountain held secrets, but this was beyond his darkest fears. "It's a place of old magic, Captain," he said. "A place of the old ways. The ones who were here before the natives. I've heard the stories, the songs. The hollow is a doorway." "What kind of doorway?" McIntyre asked, his voice barely a whisper. "A doorway to the other side," Creech said. "A place where the veil is thin. The company, or maybe just Rourke, they found it, they knew what it was. They've been making sacrifices, Captain. They've been feeding the darkness." The revelation of the ancient, sacrificial nature of the hollow, combined with the testimony of Jasper Tate, provided McIntyre with the ammunition he needed to bring Silas Rourke down. He knew he couldn't present the evidence of the occult, the dark lake, and the strange markings to a court of law, he would be laughed at. But he could use it to put pressure on Rourke, to force him to make a mistake. He wrote a detailed report, outlining his findings about the company's activities, and he sent it to the senator in Washington. But he knew that the legal system was slow, and that Rourke would not wait for the wheels of justice to turn. He had to act now. McIntyre's final confrontation with Silas Rourke did not take place in a courtroom. It took place in the hollow, the devil's seat, the place where so many of the region's secrets had been buried. Rourke, warned by his spies of McIntyre's activities, had decided to take matters into his own hands. He had gathered his men, the same thugs who had ambushed McIntyre before, and they had followed him to the hollow, intending to put an end to his investigation once and for all. McIntyre was descending into the pit when he heard the sounds of approach. He was trapped. He had only his revolver and a small knife. He could hear Rourke's men moving along the edge of the pit, their torches casting long, dancing shadows. Then he heard Rourke's voice echoing down from above. "You should have stayed out of this, McIntyre," Rourke shouted. "You're a dead man, you just don't know it yet. The mountain's got a taste for you. It's been feeding on you since the day you arrived." McIntyre didn't reply. He was already moving, his mind racing. He had to get to the cavern, to the dark lake. The mountain, he had come to believe, was not a passive entity. It was a willing participant in the sacrifices, and perhaps it had a will of its own. He began to crawl back through the narrow passageway, back toward the cavern. Behind him, he could hear Rourke's men entering the pit. A gunshot rang out, the bullet ricocheting off the rock wall. Another shot, closer now. He reached the cavern, the vast, subterranean space. The lake was there, dark and still. The bones were on the shore, just as he had seen them. Rourke and his men emerged from the passageway. There were 6 of them, including Rourke. They were armed with rifles and pistols. McIntyre had only his revolver, and he had only a few rounds left. "You're going to die, McIntyre," Rourke said, a cruel smile on his lips.
"But first, I want you to see what you've been looking for. I want you to see what happens to people who stick their noses where they don't belong." Rourke gestured to the dark lake. "The mountain demands blood, McIntyre. It always has. And it's about to get yours."
McIntyre had no time to think.
He had to act. He took a step back, his heel hitting the edge of the lake. The water was cold, impossibly cold.
And as he watched, the surface of the water began to ripple, as if something was rising from the depths. The air grew thick with the metallic scent. A low, guttural sound, like the growl of a beast, echoed through the cavern. Rourke and his men were frozen in terror, their weapons forgotten.
For a moment, the attention of everyone in the cavern was fixed on the lake.
It was the diversion McIntyre needed. In the flickering light of their torches, he had spotted something, a small, dark opening, a crevice in the rock wall, barely visible behind a boulder.
He had no idea where it led. He knew it might be his only chance.
He waited, his heart pounding, as Rourke took a step back, his face a mask of pure terror.
The growl grew louder. The ripples on the lake's surface became more agitated.
And then, with a sudden, violent surge, a dark shape erupted from the water. It was a creature of nightmare, a thing of shadow and malice, its form vaguely human, but twisted, wrong. It let out a shriek that tore through the silence of the mountain. McIntyre seized his chance. He dove for the crevice. He squeezed himself into the narrow opening, scraping his hands and shoulders. Behind him, he heard Rourke and his men screaming, the sound of gunfire, the wet, tearing sound of flesh.
He didn't look back.
He just kept moving, crawling, squeezing through the tight passageway, until he finally emerged into the cool night air, on the side of the mountain, far from the hollow. He had escaped the Devil's Seat, but he had not escaped its curse. He had seen what lay beneath the mountain, the reality behind the legend, and it had broken something inside him. He returned to his room at the boarding house and sat in the dark. He wrote a final, desperate letter to the senator, outlining the truth, the whole truth, about the hollow and the company's complicity in the darkness. He finished the letter and sealed it. He then wrote a second letter, this one to Caleb Hayes, explaining what he had found and asking him to protect the innocents of Laurel Creek. He was leaving, he said. He had to leave, or he would go mad. The next morning, Duncan McIntyre was gone. The constable found his room empty, his belongings gone, save for a single piece of paper on his desk. It was a note, written in a shaking hand. It read, "The mountain is a gateway to the past. The past is where I must go. Do not follow." The legend of Elias Ward, the missing surveyor, and Mary Halloran, the murdered schoolteacher, has faded into the broader folklore of the Cumberland Plateau. Their names are no longer spoken with the same urgency they once were. But the stories persist, passed down through the generations as cautionary tales. The hollow itself, the Devil's Seat, remains. The entrance to the ancient pit has been sealed, ostensibly for safety reasons, by the authorities. But there are rumors that the seal was not placed by the county, but by a private company, perhaps the same company that Silas Rourke worked for all those years ago. The location of the hollow, once a closely guarded secret, has been lost to time. Some say it is still there, hidden in the dense forest, waiting to be rediscovered. Others believe it was destroyed, flooded, buried by a landslide. The truth is, no one knows for certain. The story of Duncan McIntyre has its own peculiar coda. A century after his disappearance, a group of hikers, exploring a remote section of the plateau, stumbled upon a small, abandoned cabin, deep in the woods. Inside, they found a leather-bound journal, half-eaten by mold. It was written in a cramped, spidery hand. The journal's author was never identified, but the handwriting was consistent with the samples of Duncan McIntyre's known correspondence, the letters he had written to the senator. The journal described, in fragmented and often incoherent detail, the events of McIntyre's final days. He had returned to the hollow, he wrote, to try to undo what had been done. He had tried to seal the doorway, to break the mountain's hold. He had failed. The last entry was dated nearly 3 years after his disappearance, and it read, simply, "The mountain knows my name. And it is waiting for me to come home." The hikers left the journal where they found it. They were afraid. They knew that some secrets are best left buried. In the end, the truth of what happened beneath the Cumberland Plateau may never be fully known. The official records are lost, the witnesses are long dead, and the mountain itself is a silent and uncooperative witness. But the stories persist, because they speak to something fundamental about the human experience: our fear of the unknown, our hunger for power, and our capacity for unspeakable cruelty. The disappearance of Elias Ward, the murder of Mary Halloran, and the dark secrets of the Hollow remain an unsolved mystery, a haunting reminder that even in the modern world, there are still places where the old laws hold sway, where the line between the living and the dead is perilously thin, and where the mountain's shadow falls long and cold. To this day, there are still those who venture into the deep woods of the Cumberland Plateau, hoping to find the Devil's Seat, to unlock its secrets, and to discover what happened to the souls who were claimed by the Hollow Mountain. But those who know the region's true history understand that the best course of action is to stay away, to leave the old legends undisturbed, and to let the mountain sleep. The question that remains, the question that will likely never be answered, is this: when the mountain finally awakens, what will it find waiting for it? And what will it do?